The Brazilian Menendez Murders, The Golden Girl with Cold Eyes. The year is 2002. In one of São Paulo's most affluent neighborhoods, the silence of a tree-lined street hides a German-style mansion. Behind those exposed brick walls lives the Richthofen family. Manfred, a successful engineer, Maricia, a respected psychiatrist, and their 2 children. To anyone watching from the outside, they were the portrait of the golden dream. But like every classic tragedy, this perfection was merely a glass facade, waiting to shatter. In the international true crime community, we often speak of the Menendez brothers. 2 wealthy young men in Beverly Hills who, in 1989, walked into their parents' bedroom and opened fire. The world was horrified. The world was also fascinated. But Brazil has its own version of that story. A story of wealth, blood, and a betrayal so cold, it redefined a nation's understanding of evil. A story that, in many ways, is even more disturbing than the Menendez case. Because in Brazil, it wasn't a gun, it wasn't impulsive, and the person who planned it all wasn't a desperate young man. It was a daughter, a golden girl with ice in her veins and a smile that fooled an entire country. Her name was Suzane von Richthofen, and this is her story. Everything began to change when the eldest daughter, Suzane, a blonde law student with angelic features and an easy smile, met a young man from a completely different world. Daniel Cravinhos didn't have the European lineage or the bank account of the Richthofens. He was a model airplane instructor, someone Manfred and Maricia saw as little more than a phase, a distraction for their daughter that would pass like all the others. They were wrong. Daniel wasn't a phase. He was, according to investigators who would later study the case in meticulous detail, the catalyst for an obsession that slowly, quietly, and methodically would turn youthful love into a blood pact. The 2 fell into a relationship that consumed them both, but in very different ways. For Daniel, it was passion. For Suzane, it was strategy. Manfred von Richthofen was a man of conviction and discipline, traits inherited perhaps from a long line of German ancestry. He was clear. The relationship was forbidden. He refused to accept his princess, building a future with someone he considered beneath their social standing. In his mind, he was protecting his daughter. In Suzane's mind, he had just signed his own death sentence, because Suzane didn't react with common teenage rebellion. She didn't slam doors or run away. She reacted with cold surgical calculation, the kind of calm that in hindsight should have terrified everyone around her. If her parents were the obstacle between her and Daniel, and if their inheritance was what would guarantee the couple's future together, then the solution in Suzane's distorted mind was simple, horrifying, but simple. Remove the obstacle. Over the following months, what started as a romance evolved into something that can only be described as a military-grade operation. Suzane, Daniel, and his older brother Christian began to draft the plan. Let that sink in for a moment. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a rage-fueled impulse after a heated argument. This was a slow, methodical, deliberate construction. Discussed over weeks, refined over time, tested in practice runs. They chose the date. They studied the household routine. They identified the tools they would need. And most disturbingly of all, Suzane herself would serve as the inside operative, the one who would guide the killers through her own home and into the very room where her parents slept. The girl who had grown up in those halls, who had eaten at that dinner table, who had been tucked into bed in that house. She drew the map. She handed over the keys. She gave the green light. This crime wasn't born from a breakdown. It wasn't the product of a disturbed mind that snapped under pressure. It was polished, carefully, deliberately polished. During that final week of October 2002, Suzane, Daniel, and Christian acted not like impulsive teenagers, but like soldiers preparing an ambush. According to the investigation records and the painstaking testimony that would later emerge during the trial, every detail had been considered. They didn't just want to kill, they wanted it to look like something else entirely. A burglary gone wrong, a botched home invasion, an anonymous crime with no connection to the family. Suzane was the logistics mastermind. She knew which floorboards creaked. She knew which doors were left unlocked at night. She knew the rhythm of the house, the routine of her parents, the exact moment they would be most vulnerable. And most critically, she knew how to neutralize the mansion's security from the inside. Because she was the security. She was the one everyone trusted. To make the plan work, they needed weapons that made no sound. Firearms were immediately ruled out. A gunshot would echo through the quiet residential streets of Brooklyn, one of São Paulo's most upscale neighborhoods. Instead, they chose iron mallets, heavy, brutal tools that could silence a person before they had the chance to draw breath for a scream. Christian was responsible for procuring them. They wrapped the metal heads in tape and fabric, a chilling, premeditated detail designed to muffle the sound of impact, while ensuring the force remained lethal. The atmosphere inside the Richthofen mansion that Wednesday evening was one of deeply unsettling normalcy. Manfred and Maricia arrived home tired from their respective workdays. They had dinner together. They exchanged a few words. They climbed the stairs to their second-floor bedroom and went to sleep, as they had done hundreds of times before, in the home they had built, in the life they had worked for. They had no reason to be afraid. The danger wasn't outside. It wasn't a stranger in the dark. It was already inside the house, moving through the rooms they knew by heart, wearing the face of their own daughter. Around 10 p.m., Suzane took her younger brother Andreas to a LAN house, a Brazilian internet gaming cafe popular with teenagers at the time. The decision was calculated. She needed Andreas away from the house, not out of any mercy toward him, but because a younger brother wandering the halls would have been an unpredictable variable, a witness, an obstacle. Andreas, in his teenage innocence, thought it was just a kind gesture from his older sister. He had no idea that while he sat in front of a screen, immersed in a game, the life he had always known was being quietly, methodically dismantled just a few miles away. At midnight, the city began to quiet. Suzane met Daniel and Christian at a pre-arranged location. They arrived in a white Volkswagen Golf, a deliberately ordinary car, the kind that blends into any street without drawing a second glance. Daniel's heart was racing. Christian was visibly tense. But Suzane, by all accounts, maintained what investigators would later describe as a glacial calm. The kind of calm that is more frightening than any panic because it suggests something has been switched off inside a person. Something essential, something human. She handed them trash bags to cover their shoes, to avoid leaving footprints, surgical gloves for their hands, stockings to pull over their faces. Every detail anticipated, every contingency covered. They parked a short distance from the mansion. Suzane used her own key, her family home key, to open the garage gate. They entered through the library, a room that provided direct interior access without passing through the main living areas. No broken windows, no forced locks, no signs of intrusion, because there was no intrusion. There was only betrayal. Inside, the house smelled like home. The lingering scent of the coffee Maricia liked to brew in the evenings, the faint smell of the books that lined Manfred's shelves, the particular, irreplaceable smell of a family's daily life, accumulated over years, embedded in the walls and the furniture and the air itself. Suzane led the two brothers through the dark hallway. She climbed the first steps of the wooden staircase, the same staircase where, years before, she had played hide-and-seek with Andreas. She pressed her ear toward the master bedroom door. Silence. Her parents were asleep. She descended back to the ground floor and gave the signal. Time, in the accounts of those who have studied this case, seems to freeze at this moment. Suzane did not go upstairs for the final act. She stayed below, seated on the library sofa or perhaps pacing. Some versions of the story suggest she covered her ears with a cushion. What is certain is that Daniel and Christian climbed those stairs with iron mallets in their hands and sweat pooling inside their latex gloves. Every step that creaked was a warning. Every shadow was a threshold, and fate that night did not flinch. They entered the bedroom. Manfred and Maricia lay sleeping, backs turned to each other in the unconscious intimacy of long marriage. There was no warning given, no words spoken, no moment of hesitation long enough to matter. Daniel positioned himself beside Manfred, Christian beside Maricia. The first blow landed with a force that the Cravinhos brothers would struggle years later in the courtroom to find adequate words to describe. Manfred was struck first. Maricia woke to the sound of impact, but there was no time to understand, no time to react. She tried to sit up. She tried to raise her hands to her head. Christian was relentless. There were dozens of strikes. The room that had been a sanctuary of rest and privacy became, in those minutes, something that no language is sufficient to describe. When the movement on the bed finally stopped, the silence that settled over the house was more terrifying than anything that had preceded it. Suzane's parents were dead, and the performance was just beginning. The silence that followed the last mallet strike wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating, dense with the metallic scent of blood beginning to spread through the hallway. Daniel and Christian descended the stairs, trembling, their bodies flooded with adrenaline and something darker. But Suzane was waiting for them in the library with a composure that to this day continues to defy psychological explanation. She didn't ask how they were feeling. She didn't ask if it was difficult. She didn't acknowledge the magnitude of what had just happened 12 steps above them. Her first immediate organized concern was the logistics of getting away with it. Under her direction, the three began staging a robbery gone wrong. They turned over drawers, scattered papers across the floor, flung open armoires. But the staging had a flaw that forensic investigators would later identify almost immediately. It was an organized mess. The disorder was strategic rather than frantic. And critically, they knew exactly where the money was. Suzane handed Daniel and Christian a folder containing approximately $8,000 in cash and a selection of her mother's jewelry, the immediate payment for what had been done. Before leaving, Suzane went back upstairs one final time. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at her parents. Then she took a white towel and placed it over her mother's face. Forensic psychologists who later analyzed this detail were divided. Some interpreted it as a fragment of residual guilt, a gesture from a daughter who, somewhere beneath the calculation, still existed. Others were less generous. They suggested she simply couldn't tolerate the fixed, open gaze of a victim she still had work to do around. Either way, the gesture tells us something. We're just not sure what. They locked the bedroom door. They exited the way they came. The world outside the mansion was unchanged. The same quiet street, the same sleeping neighborhood. But inside that white Volkswagen, three killers drove away carrying the extracted wealth of two lives. Suzane's next stop was the gaming cafe to collect Andreas. Let that image settle for a moment. She parked. She walked in through the neon-lit entrance. She found her younger brother at his screen. She smiled at him. She asked if he'd had a good time. In that moment, she was the only person alive who knew that the boy in front of her had, in her absence, become an orphan. By her design. She did not take Andreas home. She left him with a neighbor or at a hotel, offering a vague explanation. Something about a problem with the lock. Something that didn't quite add up, but was enough to buy the time she needed. She was already preparing the stage for the next act. Hours later, the performance reached its dramatic peak. Suzane called the police. Her voice on the call was that of a terrified, grief-shattered daughter. When officers arrived at the mansion on Rua Jesuino Maciel, they found a fragile blonde girl collapsed in the garden, weeping in what appeared to be complete devastation. But to the veteran investigators who stepped inside the house, the scene didn't feel right. The mess was too deliberate, too curated. The valuables that a desperate thief would have grabbed first were still there. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere. No broken glass, no damaged locks. The door had been opened by someone who had a key. Someone who knew the house intimately. Someone who was, at this very moment, performing grief in the garden. If there was a single moment in which Suzane von Richthofen came closest to convincing an entire country, it was at the funeral of Manfred and Maricia. She arrived dressed entirely in black, her eyes concealed behind dark sunglasses, her expression composed into something that read, at least from a distance, as devastation. She clung to Andreas, the brother she had orphaned, as though he were her only anchor in the world. She leaned over the coffins. She wept. The nation watched through television cameras and felt collectively a profound and genuine sympathy for this poor orphaned girl. Meanwhile, the investigators behind the cameras were watching something else entirely. Daniel Cravinhos was present, playing the role of the supportive boyfriend, the steady shoulder. But their behavior together, the particular nature of their closeness during what should have been a moment of pure familial grief, began to attract uncomfortable attention. Suzane didn't carry herself like someone desperate for justice. She moved through the funeral like someone managing a situation, like someone who knew exactly what was happening and was ensuring it went according to plan. The theater was well executed, but the script had holes. Here is the detail that stopped even the most hardened homicide detectives cold. 3 days after the burial of her parents, Suzane von Richthofen turned 19 years old. Any person who had just lost their parents in the manner Manfred and Maricia had been lost would have been shattered, catatonic, incapable of leaving a darkened room. Suzane decided to celebrate. She, Daniel, and Christian went to a luxury hotel, later to a nightclub. There was music, there were drinks, there was laughter. They paid with the blood-stained money taken from the Richthofen household. For Suzane, her parents' deaths were not a tragedy to be mourned. They were a transaction, a liberation, financial, personal, and romantic all at once. She believed she was finally free. Free to love Daniel without interference. Free to access the inheritance she had decided was already hers. What she did not understand was that, even as she raised a glass to her new life, the São Paulo police were quietly and methodically connecting dots that would lead, with the inevitability of a closing trap, from that luxury motel to a cold concrete cell. The investigation accelerated faster than the killers had anticipated, and the first crack in the facade came not from Suzane, whose calculation held for the moment, but from Christian Cravinhos, who made the kind of mistake that only someone unaccustomed to having money makes. 2 days after the crime, Christian purchased a high-performance Suzuki GSXR 1100 motorcycle. He paid in cash with $100 bills. A young man of modest means with no fixed income buying a luxury bike in foreign currency days after the most talked-about crime in the country, and with a direct connection to the victim's family. The seller contacted the authorities. The thread had been found. Meanwhile, Suzane's behavior at the police station was raising its own alarms. She wasn't asking about progress in finding the supposed intruders. She was asking about the life insurance policies, about bank accounts, about the cars, about the inventory of the estate. The Golden Girl was moving too fast toward the inheritance, and the shine on her glass mask was finally beginning to crack. While Brazil wept publicly for Suzane and the tragedy of the Richthofen family, the investigators of the São Paulo Civil Police, men who had spent careers looking at the worst human beings were capable of, felt a persistent growing unease. The crime scene on Rua Jesuíno Maciel simply did not speak the language of a common robbery. The disorder was inconsistent. Too clean in some areas, too chaotic in others, in precisely the wrong places. The valuables that would have been grabbed first by any professional thief had been left behind. The valuables that required intimate knowledge of the household had been taken. Lead investigator Dr. Ricardo Guanais later described it as the smell of the case. Not the smell of death. He was accustomed to that. The smell of a lie that had been carefully constructed by someone who knew this house the way only a family member could. Suzane's conduct reinforced it. Instead of a daughter consumed by grief and demanding answers, investigators found a young woman consumed by impatience and pointing that impatience in precisely the wrong direction. She wasn't asking who had killed her parents. She was asking when she could access the inheritance. She wasn't asking about fingerprints or leads. She was asking about property titles and bank balances. The Golden Girl was in far too much of a hurry to inherit the throne. Christian Cravinhos had never, in his life, had access to the kind of money he was now holding. To a young man of his background, those $100 bills from the Richthofen safe weren't capital to be managed or carefully concealed. They were possibility, immediate, intoxicating possibility. 2 days after the crime, he walked into a motorcycle dealership and purchased a Suzuki GSXR 1100, one of the most powerful production motorcycles available at the time. He paid entirely in cash, in American currency. The salesperson, who was not unaware of the case dominating the national news, recognized the profile mismatch instantly. A young man of Christian's apparent means, paying in foreign bills, with a connection to a family at the center of the country's biggest crime story. The call to authorities took very little deliberation, and when police crossed the motorcycle purchase against Christian's identity, against his relationship to Daniel, against Daniel's relationship to Suzane, the Tower of Cards began its inevitable collapse. On the afternoon of November 8, 2002, all three were brought in for questioning at the DHPP, São Paulo's Department of Homicides and Personal Protection. The police strategy was as old as interrogation itself, and precisely as effective. Separation. Suzane in one room, Daniel in another, Christian in a third. The hallway between them silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of typewriters. The investigators understood that Christian was the weakest point in the chain, not because he was unintelligent, but because he had the least invested. He didn't share Daniel's obsessive devotion to Suzane. He didn't have Suzane's sociopathic composure. He was a young man who had done something irreversible in service of a plan that wasn't entirely his own, and who was now sitting in a police interrogation room wondering how much the other two had already said. The detectives played on that uncertainty. They implied, falsely as a calculated tactical move, that Daniel and Suzane were already talking, that the story was already coming out, that the only question now was who would be the one left holding the full weight of it. Christian crumbled. Between sobs that shook his entire frame, he said the words that would redirect the entire investigation. "I didn't want to do this. It was Suzane who asked me to." When investigators carried that confession into Daniel's room, the effect was immediate and total. The future he had constructed in his imagination. A future besides Suzane, funded by the Richthofen inheritance, free from the opposition of parents who had dismissed him, evaporated in the space of a sentence. He confessed. He described the mallets, the stockings, the route through the house, and the detail that would become one of the most haunting images of the entire case. Suzane, downstairs, waiting, calm, as though she were simply waiting for a delayed dinner. But it was Suzane's response that left the room truly silent. When detectives entered her room and informed her that both Cravigno's brothers had confessed in full, Suzane von Richthofen did not cry. She did not deny. She did not collapse, or rage, or beg. She looked at the detective across the table from her with an expression that multiple officers present described as utterly flat, evacuated a feeling, and said, "They already told you everything. Then I have nothing left to say." In that sentence, the mask of the grieving orphan fell away completely and permanently. What remained was an 18-year-old woman who appeared in that moment to be more frustrated by the failure of the plan than by the death of the two people who had raised her. Days after the confessions, Brazil paused to watch the crime scene reenactment, a standard procedure in the Brazilian justice system, filmed and broadcast nationally. Suzane was escorted back to the mansion on Rua Jesuíno Maciel, not as its daughter and future heir, but as the primary suspect in the murder of its owners. She walked through the rooms of her childhood home flanked by investigators and protected by a heavy security detail. The crowds gathered outside had made their feelings unmistakably clear. Daniel, during his portion of the reenactment, wept. He showed visible physical signs of what looked like genuine remorse when he re-entered the bedroom where the carpeting still carried the evidence of what had happened there. Suzane pointed. She indicated positions and distances with the calm precision of someone walking a director of photography through a set she had designed herself. She showed investigators where the signal was given. She explained the route taken, the timing, the exits. Her voice did not waver. There were no tears. Her parents, it seemed, had become, in her processing of events, simply removed variables, obstacles that were no longer relevant. It was at this point that the international true crime community began to draw the comparison that would define how the Richthofen case is discussed beyond Brazil's borders. The Brazilian Menendez Murders. Like Lyle and Eric Menendez, Suzane was the living disproof of the comfortable assumption that wealth protects, that privilege insulates, that families with enough money and education are somehow shielded from the darkest possibilities of human nature. The beauty of Suzane's features and the opulence of the Richthofen mansion served not as a backdrop to the story, but as an essential part of it, because the contrast between the setting and the act is precisely what makes it so difficult to comprehend. The world asked the same question Brazil asked. How does a girl who has everything choose this? The psychological evaluations that emerged during the investigation began to sketch an answer, and it was not a comfortable one. Suzane didn't want the money, not only. What she wanted, the report suggested, was absolute control. The money was the means, and control was the end. And Manfred, with his European discipline and his refusal to yield, represented the one force in her life she had not yet been able to bend. So she broke it instead. July 2006. Nearly 4 years after the mallets fell in that second-floor bedroom, Brazil's legal system arrived at its reckoning. The courthouse was not merely a venue for justice. It was the epicenter of a media spectacle without precedent in Brazilian criminal history, and by the standards of international true crime, one that rivaled the most watched trials anywhere in the world. Thousands gathered outside the building, some to demand justice for Manfred and Maricia, others simply to catch a glimpse of the woman they had watched on their television screens for 4 years. The fatal blonde, the golden girl. The girl who had everything and chose blood. Inside, the air was dense with expectation. And then Suzane walked in. Her legal team had prepared her appearance with the same methodical precision she had once applied to murder. The clothes were deliberately simple. The makeup was reduced to near invisibility, and her hair had been cut with a fringe, bangs, that fell across her forehead in a way that made her look younger, softer, almost childlike. It became known in the press as the innocent girl makeover, a deliberate, calculated attempt to erase the cold-eyed architect of a double murder and replace her image with that of a frightened, impressionable young woman who had been manipulated by an older, dominant boyfriend. The clash of narratives. Suzane's defense pushed a single consistent narrative. She was a victim. Daniel Cravinhos, they argued, was the true mastermind, a controlling, manipulative figure who had exploited Suzane's emotional vulnerability and orchestrated the entire plan to access the Richthofen fortune. She was not a killer. She was a girl who had been used. Daniel's defense fired back with equal force. The Daniel who appeared in that courtroom was not the arrogant young man of 2002. He was visibly worn, diminished, carrying something heavy in his posture. He stated clearly and repeatedly that Suzane was the brain of the operation, that she had designed the plan, set the timeline, provided access, and been the only one who testayed, who throughout the entire process had never once shown any indication of remorse or hesitation. He described the pressure she applied. He described her composure. He described waiting for a signal from a girl who had just confirmed her sleeping parents could be killed. The prosecution had evidence sufficient to make the competing narratives almost beside the point. The psychological evaluations were unambiguous. Suzane presented markers of antisocial personality, a profound and consistent absence of empathy, and an above-average intelligence she had directed entirely toward the service of her own ends. The jury did not deliberate long. In the early hours of July 22nd, the verdict was delivered. Suzane von Richthofen and Daniel Cravinhos were each sentenced to 39 years and 6 months in prison. Christian Cravinhos received 38 years. The Golden Girl, formally and irrevocably, traded the Brooklyn mansion for a concrete cell. Suzane was not sent to a standard correctional facility. Given the severity of the crime and the national profile of the case, she was transferred to the Tremembé Women's Penitentiary in the interior of São Paulo, a facility that had acquired, over the years, the unofficial designation of Brazil's celebrity prison. It housed the country's most high-profile female convicts, those whose crimes were too notorious and whose safety among the general prison population was too uncertain for standard placement. What happened inside Tremembé confounded even those who had followed the case most closely. Suzane, far from being isolated or marginalized, rose. She was educated, multilingual, and organized in an environment where those qualities were rare and valuable. She secured work in the prison's sewing workshop. She coordinated internal activities. She built alliances and earned a reputation, not for violence, but for competence and reliability. The girl who had once managed the logistics of a double homicide was now managing the social dynamics of a maximum security women's prison. And she was good at it. Wherever Suzane went, power followed, even behind concrete walls. Perhaps the strangest chapter in Suzane's incarceration was her relationship with Sandra Regina Gomez, known throughout Tremembe simply as Sandrão. Sandrão was a figure of considerable status within the prison, serving a sentence for the kidnapping of a businesswoman. She commanded both respect and fear in equal measure. The layer of strangeness thickened when the full picture emerged. Before becoming involved with Suzane, Sandrão had been the partner of another of Brazil's most notorious inmates, Elise Matsunaga, the woman convicted of killing and dismembering her husband, the owner of the Yoki Food Company. The union between Suzane and Sandrão, formalized through a domestic partnership agreement inside the prison, became a national scandal in its own right. The girl who had orchestrated her parents' deaths to be free to love Daniel Cravinhos now signed legal documents binding herself to a kidnapper. Inside the prison, that was her punishment. The relationship lasted several years, and it demonstrated as clearly as anything that had come before that Suzane's capacity to adapt, to navigate, and to accumulate influence was not a product of the free world. It was something built into her. Wherever she was placed, she found a way to make it her domain. Beginning in 2015, Suzane's legal status shifted to a semi-open regime, triggering what would become one of the most viscerally controversial ongoing stories in Brazilian public life: the saidinhas. The term refers to a provision in Brazilian law, the temporary furlough system, which allows inmates in semi-open regime to leave prison for limited periods on specific holidays. 4 times a year, on dates including Mother's Day, Father's Day, and Christmas, Suzane von Richthofen walked out of Tremembe and into the free world for a few days at a time. For international audiences, it is worth pausing to let the full weight of that irony register. The woman who murdered both of her parents, who planned, facilitated, and ordered the killings, was legally entitled by the very justice system that had convicted her to leave prison and celebrate the holidays dedicated to honoring the parents she had killed. Every furlough became a media event. Photographers camped outside Tremembe days in advance. Her new appearance, her clothing, the car that collected her, the name of whoever accompanied her, all of it was documented, analyzed, and broadcast. Suzane walked toward the waiting vehicle with a measured smile and the same unhurried composure that had defined her since the night of October 30th, 2002. She did not engage with the crowds. She did not acknowledge the shouts. And there were shouts every time she walked, as though exercising a right which, under Brazilian law, she was. In an attempt to manage her public image, Suzane agreed to a historic interview with television presenter Gugu Liberato, conducted inside the prison and broadcast to a national audience that tuned in with an intensity typically reserved for sporting finals. The Brazil that watched expected something, a crack in the composure, a moment of genuine emotion, something that would resolve the fundamental question the case had posed since 2002. Was there a human being inside Suzane von Richthofen, or only the architecture of one? What they got was a performance. Suzane spoke slowly, almost robotically. The apologies, when they came, arrived in the correct grammatical form, but were somehow drained of the substance that would have made them feel real. Her eyes, as multiple commentators noted afterward, did not match what her mouth was saying. When pressed on what she felt about her parents, not what she regretted, but what she felt, her answers drifted into abstraction. She spoke of the mistake that was made in the passive voice. She spoke of the pain caused as though it were a weather event, something that had occurred rather than something she had authored. The interview resolved nothing. In some ways, it made things worse, because the Brazil that had spent years hoping for some sign of the daughter underneath the case, some flicker of the girl who had once played hide-and-seek on that staircase, found instead the confirmation of what investigators had suspected since November 2002. She didn't regret what she had done. She regretted being caught. In recent years, Suzane has taken what can only be described as her most audacious step. the attempt at complete reintegration. She enrolled in a university degree program. She established a small artisan business, selling handcrafted goods online. And then, in a development that produced a very specific kind of silence in those who had followed the case for 2 decades, she became pregnant. She gave birth to a son. She married a physician in the interior of São Paulo, and she changed her name formally and legally to Suzane Louise Magnani Muniz, discarding the surname Richthofen with the same deliberateness with which she had 20 years earlier arranged for its last 2 bearers to be killed. For one side of the debate, this arc represents exactly what a justice system is supposed to produce. A person who has served their time, reformed, and re-entered society as a functioning member capable of building something instead of destroying it. For the other side, it represents something far more uncomfortable. The most sophisticated disguise yet worn by a mind that has never stopped calculating. Because somewhere, in a part of São Paulo that asks no questions, Andreas Richthofen still lives with the wreckage of what his sister did. Andreas, who was at a gaming cafe that night, who had no idea, who lost everything. His silence, in contrast to Suzane's continued visibility, is the detail that this story never adequately accounts for. The Richthofen case did not end when the judge's gavel fell in July 2006. It left a wound in the collective psyche of Brazil that is never fully closed, not because the story is unresolved, but because the questions it raises about human nature have no clean resolution. In criminology, the case is now a standard reference point for the study of upper-class parricide. It exploded a comforting national mythology, the unspoken belief that brutal crime was a product of poverty, deprivation, of exclusion from the social contract. Suzane shattered that mythology entirely. She proved that evil doesn't require want. It doesn't require desperation. It can emerge, fully formed and methodically organized, under crystal chandeliers and beside bookshelves full of law textbooks. The question that continues to echo in psychology and law faculties across Brazil is the question for which no one has yet produced a satisfying answer. What happened inside Suzane von Richthofen? There was no documented history of abuse. There were no visible trauma markers. There was a prohibition on a relationship, a prohibition that millions of teenagers have experienced and survived without reaching for iron mallets. What was present in Suzane, or absent from her, that allowed the circuit that connects an obstacle to a human life to simply not fire? We don't know. And that not knowing is part of what makes the case impossible to put down. Over the past 2 decades, the world of true crime has had to confront a question it keeps generating and never quite answering. When does documenting evil become celebrating it? We've been here before. The Ted Bundy documentaries that his surviving victims described as grotesque, unwanted revivals of their trauma. The Netflix Dahmer series that generated enormous viewership and an equally enormous backlash from the families of his victims. The persistent, uncomfortable fact that some of the most watched content in the history of streaming has been the detailed dramatization of real human atrocities. Brazil arrived at this question through Suzane. Best-selling books, most notably Ulysses Campbell's Suzane Assassina e Manipuladora, turned the case into literature. The simultaneous release of 2 competing films, The Girl Who Killed Her Parents and The Boy Who Killed My Parents, presented the story from both Suzane's and Daniel's perspectives, allowing audiences to inhabit the points of view of killers. The Prime Video series Tremembé, which dramatized life inside the celebrity prison, introduced a new generation to Suzane's story with high production values and sympathetic character construction. The debate is real. By making monsters protagonists, do we risk something? Do the families of victims, Andreas Richthofen most obviously, who has lived most of his adult life in the shadow of a story he did not ask to be part of, have a right to an oblivion that the entertainment industry keeps denying them? The counter-argument is equally serious. Ignored cases do not disappear. Unexamined evil does not instruct us. The discomfort of looking directly at what Suzane did and asking why may be exactly the discomfort that eventually helps someone recognize a pattern before it completes itself. There is no resolution to that debate, only the obligation to keep having it honestly. The woman who was released to open regime in 2023 is not, in any externally visible sense, the 18-year-old who walked into police headquarters in November 2002. She has a different name, a different face, older, calmer, the intensity of youth replaced by something more settled, a different life, with a husband and a child in a city that may not know her history, or may simply choose not to raise it. She has done what the system asked of her. She served her time, in the technical sense. She moved through the required stages. She presented consistently the face of a woman who had reflected and changed. But here is the question that the case will not release. How can a woman who, with full premeditation and in service of nothing more than the desire for control and inheritance, arranged the deaths of her own parents, be trusted with the formation of a new family? The child she is raising has a mother whose defining act was the destruction of the family that made her. Andreas Richthofen, who has spoken little and publicly almost not at all, carries a version of this story in his body that no therapy fully reaches. Is Suzane Magnani Muniz a rehabilitated person? Or is she the most accomplished performance of rehabilitation that the Brazilian criminal justice system has yet encountered? We cannot know. And perhaps that uncertainty is itself the most honest conclusion available. As this account closes, one image remains: the mirage of the golden girl. Suzane von Richthofen had the world arranged at her feet. Education, opportunity, a family that, whatever its tensions, was intact and functional. She looked at all of it and chose something else. She chose the calculation over the feeling, the inheritance over the parents, the plan over the people. The Richthofen story is, in the end, a story about what happens when the wiring that connects us to other human beings, the wiring that makes their pain legible to us, that makes their existence feel like something we owe care to, is either absent or has been, through some process we cannot fully map, switched off. They say that freedom is the most precious thing a human being can possess. Suzane has her legal freedom now. But freedom is not only the absence of walls. Is someone who carries the weight of 2 coffins in their conscience ever truly free? Or does she move through her new life in a cell without walls, where every laugh from her child, every ordinary family morning, carries the echo of what she took from her own? In the end, the bill always comes due. Sometimes not in years of imprisonment, sometimes in the silence of a room where the people who made you no longer exist, in the perfume that no memory can quite reconstruct, in the face that looks back from every mirror and carries, somewhere in its expression, the knowledge of what it authorized. Suzane's price was too high, and the change is the oblivion she will never have. And you? What do you think about Suzane's new life? Do you believe in rehabilitation? That people can genuinely change?